What's up, Safari Nation, and welcome back to yet again another video. It is so good to see you guys. Now, today I'm not going to be talking doom and gloom, and with this whole coronavirus pandemic, I have only one goal in mind, and that is to not add to the anxiousness and negativity that's going around in the world. So don't see this video as negative, but rather informative. It's not there to spread hopelessness and anxiety, but it's there just to raise my concerns and ask for your help. And not in a monetary sense. I literally just want some of your advice and your input. Now, we all know that this coronavirus pandemic has affected world travel and the tourism industry at a great scale. And with this thought in mind, I started to think what the effects of this would have on the African conservation scene. I couldn't find too much information on this specific topic and only managed to get a handful of articles that really spoke about this. And one article in particular really stood out on the perk.org website, and I'll link it in the description below. But in this article, they really spoke about what the potential severity the lack of tourism in Africa can have on the conservation. The article states that hunting and photo tourism industries provide a chief motivation for wildlife conservation and much of the funding that sustains it. South Africa is Africa's second largest tourism market and relies heavily on the income from tourists for its conservation. Now, with this lack of tourism, the future of South African conservation is quite uncertain. Out of nearly 16.4 million working people in South Africa, over 1.5 million of them are employed within the tourism sector. And the sector itself accounts for nearly 10% of South Africa's economical GDP. So the tourism sector in South Africa has a huge role to play, and not just from a conservation point of view, but also as a social economic point of view. The global demand for wildlife-based recreation has created a clear and very necessary link between tourism and conservation funding. 80% of all international tourists to South Africa take part in some form of wildlife recreational activities. In 2018 alone, tourism-related fees accounted for 84% of the South African National Park System's budget. Another very important part of conservation within South Africa are the private game reserves and nature conservancies. Now, these account for over 20 million hectares of land, which is over 5 times the surface area of the national park system as a whole. And at least 43% of international tourists visit these private reserves and conservancies. Tourism to private wildlife areas adds hundreds of millions of dollars to South Africa's economy via direct sales alone. Wider economic impact is generated through the jobs private wildlife areas have created. These economic contributions, combined with the fact that wildlife conservation has historically been more profitable for landowners than conventional agriculture, have created a powerful economic incentive in South Africa to conserve large areas of habitat and recover species like the southern white rhino. Hunting plays a huge role within South Africa's wildlife conservation system, and it accounts for over 50% of the revenue generated by these private wildlife conservancies. And whether or not you agree with hunting from a moral point of view, it is essential for the conservation of Africa's wildlife and its habitat. Currently, the hunting industry within South Africa supports nearly 20,000 people with employment. Often, hunting operation staff are drawn from the rural communities surrounding wildlife areas. As layoffs mount, industry leaders are concerned that economic desperation may lead to increase in widespread poaching, both for food and for species like rhino. The article also stated that decreased cash flow could also mean that hunting operations are unable to pay the landowners whose land they've leased for hunting. These leases have historically created an incentive to manage marginal ranch land for wildlife instead of cattle. So should the incentive decrease due to a decline in the hunting market, landowners may be encouraged to return their lands to cattle production due to the meat-growing demands for beef in China and elsewhere. Now, you don't need to be an expert to kind of put two and two together and realize that that is a bad thing for conservation within South Africa. As the article continues, it states that the crisis brings into focus the fragility of South Africa's tourism-centric wildlife conservation model, one shared with other nations like Kenya. Relying on tourism to underwrite and incentivize conservation leaves conservation vulnerable to social, political, and economic shocks like the current one. It is clear that we need to do some things differently and adjust the way that we approach conservation within Africa if we are going to protect the pristine wildlife regions we already have. Now, the article concludes that conservation within a country shouldn't rely solely on the income from tourism, because it is so vulnerable to things like this coronavirus pandemic. So my question is this: how do we change the outcome? How do we diversify the sources of income that supports conservation? What can we do practically to make sure we manage to conserve everything we fought so hard to build and protect?